Welcome back to Untold Secrets of Ancient America, where we uncover the buried knowledge and long-forgotten voices of the first peoples of this land. Today, we venture into one of the most powerful, yet often invisible institutions of the ancient world. Not a stone pyramid or an earthen mound, but the living minds of elders who carried centuries of knowledge without ever writing a word. This is the story of the story keepers, memory elders, and living libraries. Before scrolls, tablets, or books, before the concept of archives or libraries, human knowledge was passed from mouth to ear, from heart to heart, across generations. In ancient America, story keepers weren't just tellers of tales. They were the record keepers, the scientists, the legal advisors, and the spiritual authorities. Through complex systems of memory, ritual, performance, and oral repetition, they preserved entire civilizations. Who were these people? How did they carry such enormous volumes of knowledge? And what does it mean to lose a library that breathes? Today, we pull back the curtain on a world where every elder was a book, every village a university, and every story a thread in the fabric of survival. In the ancient Americas, the ability to remember wasn't just respected, it was revered. To remember well was to hold power. The power to maintain law, explain origins, negotiate alliances, and even heal sickness. Forgetting, by contrast, could bring chaos. In societies without written texts, a forgotten name could mean a broken bloodline. A forgotten ceremony could unravel a community's place in the cosmic order. Memory was not optional. It was a sacred duty. Take the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Their entire political system, known as the Great Law of Peace, was transmitted orally for centuries. This wasn't just a few ceremonial phrases. It was a constitutional structure, with rules of governance, protocols for conflict resolution, procedures for adopting new members into the Confederacy, all passed down through oral recitation. The individual who carried and recited this knowledge was often a specially trained elder, known as a wampum keeper. They used strings and belts of woven shell beads to aid memory, each pattern corresponding to a clause or event. But even the beads were not the knowledge itself. They were memory triggers. The true library was the person. The Inca Empire, too, had no formal writing system, yet its administrators oversaw one of the most complex societies in the world using quipus, bundles of knotted strings in which numerical values and narrative structures were encoded. The quipu, while physical, relied entirely on the interpretation of the quipucamayok, the specialist who understood how to read and orally transmit the meaning. Without the quipucamayok, the quipu was silent. Across North America, memory served as the scaffold for ecological knowledge. Among the Anishinaabe, stories about spirit beings weren't mere fables. They embedded information about plant behavior, animal migration, seasonal cycles, and hunting practices. Tales of Nanabojo, the great trickster hero, carried coded lessons on ethics, strategy, and survival. Each retelling reinforced not just memory, but identity, clan identity, tribal identity, and human identity in relation to the natural world. In the Amazon, entire river systems were mythologized. The Tucanoan peoples used narratives of ancestral journeys to map geography. Stories told of rivers born from divine serpents or of mountain spirits who sculpted valleys. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were cartography, hydrology, and climatology, passed through generations via ritual and song. And across the Southwest, among Pueblo cultures, every facet of community life, from farming to governance to religion, was structured around a dense web of oral tradition. Knowledge was encoded into dance cycles, sand paintings, kiva rituals, and mask ceremonies. The world itself became a text. Memory was not something you accessed. It was something you lived inside. To be a story keeper was to be a vessel for the entire society's operating system. They remembered the stars, the treaties, the prophecies, the medicines, the crimes, the lineages, the sacred songs that summoned rain, and those that buried the dead. They remembered the beginning of the world and the obligations that sustained it. They were the architects of continuity. So how did one become a story keeper? It was never random. It was rarely voluntary. In many cultures, the role was inherited or appointed based on a child's aptitude, temperament, or spiritual calling. Training began early and lasted a lifetime. Among the Zuni, children destined for ritual roles began learning sacred songs and stories at a young age. These weren't mere bedtime tales. They were structured mythologies tied to real-world functions, like weather prediction, fertility cycles, and ceremonial choreography. As the children grew, they moved from stories into rituals, from rituals into leadership roles. By adulthood, a Zuni priest might carry hundreds of songs, chants, and narratives, each with its own sequence, tone, and context of use. In Inuit communities, youth were trained in environmental knowledge through storytelling. Elders recounted events such as dangerous hunts, ice fractures, or spirit encounters, embedding them with detailed observations of wind patterns, snow textures, and animal behavior. This storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was field training. A well-told story could prepare a child for a life-or-death moment years later. Among the Lakota and Dakota peoples, memory training often took place within the vision quest and Sundance traditions. These ceremonies weren't just spiritual epiphanies, they were encoded rites of passage. The experiences, songs, and visions encountered in altered states were later interpreted through long-standing story traditions. What was revealed in trance had to be understood in memory. Memory was also tactile. Among the Ojibwe and other Algonquian-speaking nations, birchbark scrolls were used as mnemonic devices. These scrolls bore etched images that cued complex recitations of medicine teachings, migration stories, and cosmological cycles. Again, the scrolls were not self-explanatory. They required a human interpreter, a story keeper who knew how to animate the symbols with breath and voice. The process of becoming a memory elder was not just intellectual, it was physical, emotional, and spiritual. Story keepers were often required to fast, to isolate, to undertake difficult pilgrimages, or to perform elaborate ceremonies before being allowed to speak certain truths aloud. And always, their memory was tested, publicly and ceremonially, because the integrity of their knowledge affected the entire community. Let's talk about the architecture of memory itself. How did ancient Americans remember so much, so accurately, for so long? The answer lies in a sophisticated use of mnemonic devices, narrative structures, and performative repetition. One of the most powerful tools was story structure itself. Ancient myths often followed repetitive cycles, with nested narratives, mirrored characters, and symbolic associations. This design allowed listeners to predict, internalize, and recall key elements. In many ways, oral myths functioned like musical compositions, using rhythm and structure to embed complex material in the mind. Another tool was spatial anchoring. Among the Mississippian cultures, large urban centers like Cahokia were laid out in ways that reinforced cosmological order. Each mound, plaza, and causeway aligned with solar and lunar cycles. The city was a giant mnemonic map, where movement through space echoed movement through story. Every ritual procession was a rewalking of creation. Color was also mnemonic. Many tribes used color coding to represent directions, emotions, and spiritual principles. For example, among the Navajo, white might represent east and dawn, black, the north, and night. These associations appeared in art, clothing, and ritual sequences, reinforcing memory through sensory repetition. Performance was crucial. Storykeepers often used song, drum beats, hand gestures, and facial expressions to animate their recitations. These weren't just embellishments, they were memory aids. The rhythm of a drum could mark transitions in a story. A change in pitch could signal the presence of a spirit or a shift in cosmological layers. Symbolic substitution was common. In many traditions, each character in a myth represented not just themselves, but a cluster of meanings. An animal figure might represent a clan, a season, a psychological state, or a geographic region. This layered symbolism allowed one story to carry multiple teachings, depending on the context. Most importantly, memory was communal. Stories were told in circles, echoed by others, corrected when necessary, and renewed through each performance. This collective reinforcement ensured accuracy over time. It also made memory a living process, not static, but adaptable within tradition. The systems of remembering were as complex as any written archive, but they lived in sound, in space, in motion. The ancient Americans didn't just tell stories, they inhabited them. But what happens when the memory line is broken? What happens when a storykeeper dies without passing on their knowledge? This is not a hypothetical question. It's the story of colonization itself. When European settlers arrived, they didn't just bring disease and weapons, they brought cultural rupture. Native languages were outlawed, ceremonies were banned. Children were taken from their families and placed into boarding schools designed to erase indigenous identity. These children were punished for speaking their mother tongues. They were forbidden from hearing the stories their ancestors had told for millennia. In many cases, they were never taught who they were. And the result? The story keepers died without apprentices. Entire oral traditions, entire cosmologies were lost in a single generation. This wasn't just cultural loss, it was intellectual devastation. Knowledge of plants, weather patterns, celestial movements, laws, treaties, and social protocols. Gone. Some fragments were captured by anthropologists, but often stripped of their ceremonial context, mistranslated, or exoticized. In places where storykeepers survived, their knowledge often had to go underground. Ceremonies were practiced in secret. Songs were whispered at night. Memory became an act of resistance. We mourn the burning of libraries in Alexandria or Baghdad. But what about the burning of libraries that wore moccasins? The libraries that prayed, danced, laughed, and remembered aloud. And yet, memory has a way of surviving. Across Native communities today, there is a revival. Language reclamation projects, oral history archives, cultural immersion schools, ceremony restorations, youth councils. In the Cherokee Nation, new generations are learning songs and stories that once risked extinction. In the Andes, communities are reviving the art of quipu interpretation. In Canada and Alaska, indigenous language apps are bringing traditional stories into the digital age. But even more powerful than technology is the return of the oral circle. Elders are speaking, youth are listening, the stories are returning. To listen to a storykeeper today is not just to hear the past, it is to witness survival, to be part of a memory chain that refused to break. The storykeepers were never just about history. They were about identity, resilience, ethics, and continuity. They were the minds that kept civilizations intact. And as we move forward into an age of information overload, maybe we can learn from them. Maybe memory, true, embodied, communal memory, is the technology we need most. Thank you for joining us on Untold Secrets of Ancient America. If this story moved you, speak it forward, share it, ask an elder, listen deeply, because in the echoes of ancient America, the stories are still speaking. Subscribe to Echoes of America for more journeys into the hidden wisdom of the past. Until next time, remember, the library never truly burned. It just changed form. And the story keepers are still here.